Nämlich aus dem fernen Silicon Valley kommt jetzt der Pascal Finette. Pascal Finette, da ist er schon. Hallo Pascal. Er kann uns sehen, weil da hinten eine Kamera aufgebaut ist und wir werden ihn auch hören können. Wir werden dieses Bild von ihm die ganze Zeit sehen, glaube ich. Eventuell sehen wir auch ein paar Folien von ihm. Pascal ist ein ganz spannender Zeitgenosse. Er gehört schon zu den Veteranen der Digitalisierung. Er war bei Mozilla, er war bei eBay, bei Google. Er ist jetzt bei Radical Ventures und er ist auch hat einen Lehrstuhl an der Singularity University. Für die Singularity University nicht kennen, Peter Diamandis und Ray Kurzweil, der Zukunftsforscher, haben vor, glaube ich, jetzt bald 10 Jahren die Singularity University ins Leben gerufen, direkt im Silicon Valley und kümmern sich um exponentielle Technologien beziehungsweise wie die Welt radikal sich verändern kann. Und darüber wird der Pascal uns gleich einen Vortrag erhalten mit dem wunderschönen Titel Disruption and the Other Side, Solving the World's Biggest Challenges. Der Vortrag wird auf Englisch sein. Wie gesagt, hier gibt es noch Sitzplätze. Ich wünsche viel Spaß und gute Unterhaltung. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So good evening for you. Very early morning for me. It's like literally 7 o'clock. I had 2 coffees, so I hope that I'm somewhat awake. And what I want to do for the next about 45 minutes is walk you through a bunch of the material we teach at Singularity University. And we typically teach this in a week-long course, which is not quite cheap. It's about $15,000 US. So we are going to compress this down into 45 minutes and you get it for free. So brace yourself for a little bit of impact. And let me share my screen so you actually can see my slides. So here we go. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen now. And what we want to do is I want to talk about a few things. I want to talk a little bit about the change we're seeing in the world. And you already heard from the previous speaker a little bit about like where this is going. So let me add a little bit of context from our perspective to this. And then I want to talk about the fabled word of disruption. And I want to show you something. I want to give you a sneak preview into some completely new material we are developing around the business models for the future. So this is going to be my next book, and we've completed the first round of research on this, and I want to show this and share this with you. So let's start with this. This is Ray Kurzweil. As mentioned earlier, Ray is one of our co-founders, and he formulated about 20 years ago something called the law of accelerating returns. And in the law of accelerating returns, what Ray found is that the rate of change in a lot of evolutionary systems, including technology systems, increases exponentially. And I'm pretty sure you have heard about this already. It's like Moore's law is a good example, like computers getting twice as fast every 2 years. Now, one thing which I think is really important to understand, which most people tend to miss, is the following idea. This is population growth over time. And as you can see, it's a true exponential trend. So you've got this explosion somewhere around the time frame in the 1500s. And what's important to understand is that technology builds on top of technology. Technology enables other technology. It stacks on top of each other. So in the case of our population on this planet, when we had the first large agricultural revolution, we had for the first time in human history, we had enough calories to feed every person on this planet, as well as for the first time in human history, we didn't spend all our time creating those calories. So we had time at our hands. And when you have time at your hands, you start to innovate. So you start innovating and you start creating stuff like the steam engine. And the steam engine gave us, for the first time in human history again, an abundance of muscle power. That then leads to further innovations, such as the electric engine, which allows us to do the same thing, but now we can do it decentralized. So one technology stacks on top of the other technology. And it's important to understand that, because the real exponentiality of technology comes from the fact that one technology enables other technologies. So computing and AI is a good example where we see this happening as well. Let me make this clearer for you. So when you heard Ray Kurzweil speak, or you read one of his books, he has a very famous saying, which is, and I think people misunderstand this. He says that the change we're seeing in the next 100 years equals the change we've seen in the last 20,000 years. And he's not using this as a metaphor. He's literally using this as a literal. And let me explain this to you, like just so like you get it super, super clear. Imagine we're sitting with you together today and we create a time machine. And with this time machine, we do something fun. We bring back an old friend of ours, Jane Austen, who lived in London about 250 years ago. So we bring her back to modern day Germany, we bring her to Berlin or Stuttgart or any other city. Imagine how she would perceive the world she would encounter today. She would probably quite literally go mad, right? Like the sheer fact of like her book, for example. In her time, like the book was a printed thing and it was expensive and it was inaccessible. Today, she would experience you having her book on a Kindle, like this magic flat device. And it's not just her book on your Kindle, it's a whole library on your Kindle. And the way the book gets onto your Kindle is through thin air via the internet. Then you would put her into your car and your car is electric. And in her age, cars were driven by hay, literally horses eating hay. There was no electricity in England in 1700. Now, for her to sit in your Tesla or Mercedes-Benz car, like what she would experience is literally a car which is driven by lightning. So for her, the change which has happened in the last 250 years is incomprehensible. Now she does another experiment. So she goes back to 1700 and she decides to repeat the same experience, the same weirdness she experienced with you. So she goes and invites an old friend of hers, the Mona Lisa. So again, she goes 250-ish years back, brings the Mona Lisa back, who lived in 1500. And how do you think the Mona Lisa would perceive London in the 1700s? She would walk through London and would basically say, well, the geopolitical situation has changed. You have the steam engine, but quite frankly, everything else just looks the same. So for our friend Jane Austen to repeat the same experience she had, to create the same level of change, she literally would need to go back and bring someone back from the age of previous, before we had the agriculture revolution. That is the change which has happened in those 250 years since she left. Let me make this even clearer. You might remember this guy here. So I grew up on this guy. This is, of course, Marty McFly, Back to the Future. This is somewhere around 1984, 1985. Like, this guy has not experienced the internet. He has not experienced mobile phones. He has not experienced food delivery via an app. None of that existed in his age. And still we do, we remember this guy. So the change we're seeing is accelerating at an incredible rate. And it leads to really weird outcomes in the future. So by the way, just for reference, I mean, of course, this was his car, back in the day. And for the record, I still love this car. And this is his car today, right? So here's an interesting insight. Ray Kurzweil looked into one particular trend, which is computations per seconds per $1,000. And we know that Moore's law is true for 50 years. And Moore's law in its purest form says that the number of transistors on an integrated circuit doubles every 2 years, meaning at the same price point, a computer becomes twice as fast every 2 years. And we've experienced this, right? Like, you need to buy a computer every couple years because the old one just feels inadequate. What Ray has shown is that this trend, this overall trend, is actually much older than Moore's law, and it has prevailed from computing paradigm to computing paradigm. So integrated circuit is what is described by Moore's law. Before that, we had transistors and vacuum tubes and so on. And what Ray showed is that for the last 110 years, and what you're seeing here is a logarithmic graph, which is the reason why you don't see it as this like steep curve, but more of a linear. He has shown that this is true for 110 years. We've new data, by the way, which validates this into the today, which shows that even over the last 10 years, this graph has been absolutely true, projecting forward. Now, the reason why this graph is important and interesting, and I think it's one of the most missed graphs probably in the world, at least in the world of computing, is you can take this graph and project it into the future. So if you believe this graph to be true into the future, and currently we don't have a reason to not believe this, by the way, you can calculate the point in time when you have a $1,000 compute device, which will have the raw compute power of a human brain, which happens in less than 11 years. By 2029, per calculation, we know that a $1,000 compute device, literally the iPhone in your pocket, will have the raw compute power of a human brain. And then it gets interesting because we know that, the law prescribes that this compute power will double every 2 years. So 2 years later, you will have 2 human brain compute power in your pocket, and then 4 and 8 and 16. And by 2050, 2060, you will have literally 7.4 billion brains in your pocket. Now, that is going to change pretty much everything we think about the way we live our lives and pursue our lives. Tomorrow, and this might be probably the most important thing to keep in mind, tomorrow will look dramatically different than today. Now, here's the challenge. As Albert Allen Bartlett, who studied these exponential trends, once said, the greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function. What he means by this is very simple. The way we humans perceive the world, the way we make sense of the world, is in a very linear fashion. Our brain is wired in a way to make sense of the world in a linear fashion. So we see the world and we try to understand it through the lens of our brains, of course. So here's a very simple example, and you can go along with this and see if you can do the math on this one here. So imagine you take 30 linear steps, one step after the other. So you go from 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. You do this 30 times. If I were to ask you how far do you get, you know exactly how far this is, right? It's 30 meters. If we were to go out on a parking lot and I would ask you, how far is 30 meters? You would know exactly how far it is. Now imagine you take 30 exponential steps. So every step is twice as far as your last step. So you go from 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, and so on. The question then becomes, how far is that? And that math is even hard. It's 2 to the power of 29. It's 1 billion meters. But more importantly, the question becomes, how far does it feel? And that is where our brain just can't compute anymore. 1 billion meters is 25 times around planet Earth. It's from here to the moon and back from the moon again. And it shows you that exponential trends have this incredible power to go from 30 to 1 billion. But more importantly, we as humans are really not well wired to understand those. That leads to an interesting outcome, which is technology moves on an exponential curve. I showed you this with computing. You can see it with in areas such as energy. When you look at the declining price of solar energy, you see it in areas like sequencing genomes, which is currently falling 7 times the rate of Moore's law, et cetera, et cetera. Now, our thinking is linear, and in this curve, we have 3 important parts. Part number 1 is what we call disappointment. This is where you look at a technology, and in the beginning, it is not good enough. You heard this from the previous speaker. You look at a chat system, for example, and it's cute, but it's not really good enough, and you're disappointed. Rightfully so, by the way. Now, the challenge with disappointment is that very often when we're disappointed, we're dismissing. But eventually you get to this thing, which we call this moment where the lines are crossing. It's an iPhone moment. Steve Jobs, 11 years ago, goes on stage, shows you the iPhone, and you know intuitively that a phone isn't a phone anymore. A phone is a small computer. And everything changes. And then we get into chaos and amazement. Chaos and amazement is where you can't keep up with the changes which are happening in the world anymore. We're moving more and more into this world. Now, let me take a step back and talk a little bit about the disappointment phase. And I want to show you why that is so incredibly important. I'm pretty sure some of you using Google Now, Siri, Alexa, or Cortana. And if you think about this, these systems are incredible because these systems are, for the first time in human history, they allow us to effectively do what we did in Star Trek, talk to our computers. But most of the time, these systems are not yet good enough. Here's an example, and I hope the audio comes through. Here's an example of how Siri still sounds today.
What time is my appointment on Sunday evening?
You have 4 appointments last Tuesday at 12 a.m.
I said, what time is my appointment on Sunday evening?
You have 4 appointments last Tuesday at 12 a.m.
I'm not asking about Tuesday.
I don't know what you mean by, I'm not asking about Tuesday. How about a web search for it?
So this is what we call the classic Siri fail. I'm pretty sure you have experienced this as well. Now here's the interesting thing about Siri. Siri as a system is only 8 years old. So Siri is a kid. Now, of course, Siri has not learned everything it needs to learn. It has a long way to go. But here's the interesting thing about Siri, and I'm using Siri as a proxy. All these systems are basically the same. Siri is currently doubling in its capacity every single year. So it's moving on Moore's law, but it's moving on Moore's law every single year. So the question for me becomes, how good will Siri be when it's 8 years older, when it's a young teenager? How good will Siri be in the next 8 to 10 years? And here's the interesting insight. Most people will get the math wrong. Because most people will look at this and say the difference between 8 and 16 is 8. It gets twice as good, so it's 8 times 2, it's 16. Now, you're by now exponential thinkers, so you know it's going to be 128 times as good. And then the question becomes, what does that even mean? What does it mean if a system like Siri is 128 times as good? Now, you need to break it down to first principles, so you need to figure out, what is Siri made of? And Siri is only a couple things. First is its voice recognition, understanding what you say, its cognition, understanding what you mean, and it's a bunch of services it connects to. You multiply those out by 128, and you will find that Siri and all these other systems in about 10 years will be better than any human in understanding them. Let me repeat that. In 10 years, these systems will be better than any human in understanding you, and then everything changes. Let me give you a simple example as how this looks like today. So you take something like Amazon's Alexa. This is the cheapest version of this is $29.99 here in the US. So it's a dirt cheap device. Today, 20% of all searches, this is 2016 data, 20% of all searches on your mobile phone are already voice-based searches. Now that's interesting because I'm pretty sure none of you is actually doing that. It's all the kids who are doing this. By 2020, ComScore estimates that about 50% of all searches are voice-based searches. And voice-based searches are interesting because they are different. They're different because they start typically with a W. People asking why, what, where, how, instead of directing the search. Let me give you an example. Let's take these guys here. Duracell. You might well remember them. Now, do you believe someone will go and say, Alexa, order a pair of Duracell M27 alkaline batteries? No, of course not. What you're going to say is, Alexa, order batteries. And guess what Alexa will ship you? Alexa will ship you these batteries. Amazon started selling batteries under their own brand, which is called Amazon Basics, about 7 years ago in the US. Amazon is by far the largest battery seller in the United States of America. Amazon's market share of Amazon Basic batteries today is 95%. 95% of all batteries Amazon sells on Amazon, and again, Amazon being the largest battery seller in the United States, is Amazon Basics. If you're Duracell, this is basically how you look like. Now, I thought, when I saw that data, I was like, yeah, sure, batteries. Who gives a damn about batteries? I don't care about my batteries. Like, few people care, and most people will be like, fine if it's good enough. And then I looked into different data. I looked at this here. This is Pampers. Pampers is the #1 brand for diapers. Amazon started selling diapers on their website under the Amazon Basic brand diaper about 3 years ago. Amazon's market share of diapers under their own brand today is 50%. We are rapidly moving into a world where we are controlled, where the access to our customers is controlled by these systems. And Alexa learns 5,000 new things to do every 100 days. So it gets better and better and better. It also already is at roughly machine level understanding of human language. There's something called the 95% word accuracy rate, which is you on average understand about 95% of the words which come out of the mouth of someone else, and that's enough for you to make sense of the world. All these systems are already roughly at human level understanding. The question you can ask yourself, and I do this regularly with executives. I was recently with Procter & Gamble and took some of the executives on this exercise, is go through a supermarket or go through a drugstore and go aisle by aisle, shelf by shelf, and ask yourself a simple question. How many of those products, which of those products do you care about the brand? And I guarantee you that that number is probably 5 to 10%. Everything else, you just don't care. Everything else, you just want to have a good enough quality. So as long as you trust someone like Amazon or Alibaba or whoever else it is, you are fine with their product. I think we will see a massive change in the way products are being sold. Now, again, as a quick reminder, the challenge with this exponential curve is when you stand somewhere where the curve ends here, and you look to the past, which is what we do all the time, which is the way we perceive the world, you see the world as very flat and linear. But when you look to the future looks really weird and very, very steep, which is the reason why we need to spend time looking at the future. Now, I want to talk about disruption a little bit. With everything we have said so far, let's talk about what does disruption actually mean. And I think disruption is a weird, misunderstood word because it's a lot like tofu. If you've ever eaten tofu, you know tofu tastes like nothing. And disruption has taken that flavor. Tofu just tastes like whatever you pour onto it. So let's start with this. There's a difference between innovation and disruption. Innovation is doing the same things, you just do them better. Let's take toothpaste. You take Colgate. The next version of Colgate is Colgate White and then becomes Colgate Super White and Ultra White and so on and so on. And the market demands that. The market says, what is new this year? So you do the same things, you just make them better. Every once in a while, you do something new, but the new thing is not yet disruptive. Let's take washing powder. So you go from washing powder to washing liquid. It's a new thing, but it's not disruptive. Disruption is when you do new things which make the old things obsolete. So this becomes really interesting because here, like you say, you create a washing machine which doesn't need washing powder anymore because it uses ultrasonic sound waves to clean your clothes. That becomes deeply disruptive. Now, the pretty much only framework we have for disruption is a 30-year-old framework written by Clayton Christian or developed by Clayton Christian called the Innovator's Dilemma. And we're using this framework pretty extensively to this day. And it's a really good framework. So let me explain how this works. If you look at a performance criteria for any product, let's say, for example, your washing powder needs to clean your clothes, there's something called the good enough line, the customer need line. So as a customer, you say, it needs to clean my clothes, and there's a certain threshold which you have. And what you find is that the incumbent, the existing company, at one point in their past, got to that customer good enough line, and then what they do is they get better and better and better because the customer demands it. The customer says, what's new this year? And the big belief was that to disrupt this market, you need to be as good as the incumbent. And what Clayton showed us is that that is not true. Clayton showed us that the new entrant creates a product which makes the old thing obsolete, but typically it's cheaper and typically it's crappier. It's not as good. But then this product moves on its own sustaining innovation line, so it gets better and better over year. But when it hits the customer need line, it gets good enough to disrupt the market. So the belief is not true that you need to be as good as the incumbent, which made the incumbent wake up. Here's a simple example. When I was 16 years old, I started shaving, and I started shaving using this single blade razor. And for all the men in the room, if you have used one of those, especially if you used it on yourself, you know it's the quickest way to cut yourself into pieces. Now, this is clearly not a good product. It got good enough when we had what is called the safety razor. So single blade, but now it's made in a way that I don't cut myself. And then we go on to a sustaining innovation line. So we add blades. So we go from 1 blade to 2 blades to 3 blades to 7 blades to 80 blades. So clearly time for someone to disrupt the system. So comes along a company called Dollar Shave Club. What Dollar Shave Club does is they sell you a product which is crappier. It's not as good. It only has 2 blades, but they innovate deeply on the business model because now they're not selling you the blades anymore. What they're selling you is a subscription. So you don't go into the drugstore anymore. You get the blades shipped to your house, much cheaper than a drugstore. They get so successful that Unilever needs to buy this company for $1 billion US. This is what we call the Innovator's Dilemma's model. Now, the challenge with this model is it's a very, very good model, but it's the only model we have for disruption. So it becomes a hammer. And when you have a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. So we've done a bunch of research to figure out what are the underlying forces which create disruption. And we have identified 3 forces, and I will give them, let me explain them briefly to you, and I'll show you an example how this looks like. The first force is this. Disruption is never one feature. It's easy to look at something like the smartphone and think the smartphone is a feature, but it is not. The smartphone is lots and lots and lots of components which come together. The second one is, and this is probably most important for existing companies, your existing skills and processes are no longer relevant. This is what breaks the neck of large companies. And the last one is this. Disruption almost always happens and reaches a tipping point at the go-to-market. Let me explain to you how this all fits together. Let's talk about these guys, Nokia. The world loves to make fun of Nokia, which is kind of sad because Nokia, you know, of course, until the iPhone was by far the most profitable, most well-known, and most powerful mobile phone brand. And the iPhone comes along and Nokia kind of loses this race. Now, when you look at this, there's a couple things which happened. The first one is this. So Nokia basically reached the good enough line, probably by the second phone from the left. And then what Nokia does is, rightfully so, it gets on a sustaining innovation line. So their product gets better and better and better over time. And it gets more feature-rich over time, which leads to 11 years ago, this phone comes out. This is Nokia N95. I bought one of those. It was about $500, $600 unsubsidized. I absolutely adored this phone. This was like, I just wanted to have it so badly. It had 2 cameras. It had a little bit of the internet on it. It had 2 weeks of battery life. So compare that with your iPhone, for example, right? But then 3 months after that, this guy comes along and everything changes. But here's the thing. This phone is more than the sum of its part. Let me show you. A phone is not just a phone. A mobile phone is a processor. It's different memory. It's different batteries. It is a touch screen. It is different sensors. It is all those things coming together. I had the great fortune and pleasure to have a bunch of ex-Nokia people in my classroom at Singularity University, and I got really curious about why they missed this thing. And I asked them, why didn't you see this? And they said, well, we did see it. But the problem was that the guy who did the processor, who was responsible for the processor, knew, of course, that the processors are getting better. The person who was responsible for the screens knew that touch screens are coming. The person who was responsible for the sensors knew that all these sensors are coming. The person who was responsible for the software knew that the software needed to be rewritten. What they couldn't do is they couldn't put it together. This is a point about like disruption just not being one feature. And I think it's really important to understand because it's easy for companies to not see the bigger picture. Here's your second one. I want to play this short video. It's a little blurry, so pardon this. This is an interview with Steve Ballmer, the CEO of Microsoft at the time. And if you remember, Microsoft at the time had a mobile phone operating system and mobile phones in the market. And this is an interview briefly after the iPhone launch being done. Just listen to what Steve has to say.
Steve, let me ask you about the iPhone and the Zune, if I may. The Zune was getting some traction, then Steve Jobs goes to Macworld and he pulls out this iPhone. What was your first reaction when you saw that?
$500 fully subsidized with a plan? I said, that is the most expensive phone in the world, and it doesn't appeal to business customers because it doesn't have a keyboard, which makes it not a very good email machine.
So it's pretty easy to laugh about Steve here, but if you listen to that clip over and over again, as I did, you'll find that he is right. He's absolutely 100% right, because the mistake he's making is he's comparing the iPhone to a phone. Whereas the iPhone in reality is this. The iPhone in reality is a little computer, which is the reason why the phone industry couldn't get disrupted by the phone industry. The phone industry had to get disrupted by the computer industry because the existing skills and processes were no longer relevant. A company like Nokia was really good at making phones, but that is not the point anymore. And here's your last one. This is Stephen Elop, who was the CEO of Nokia at the time. He said after the disaster, he said, we didn't do anything wrong, but somehow we lost. And he's right, because what they were doing is they were doing the thing they knew how to do. But what happens is that disruption almost always reaches a tipping point at the go-to-market. Nokia in their lab had products which looked a lot like the iPhone. And this is well known. But they couldn't figure out how to bring them into market because their disruption point was the go-to-market strategy. If you remember, You couldn't buy the iPhone in one of those dinky mobile phone shops where you bought your Nokia phone. Apple very deliberately said the iPhone is different. The iPhone is a computer, so we only sell it at the Apple Store, and in the US, we sold it at AT&T. Scott Cook, who's probably the best CEO I know, he's the CEO of Intuit and the founder of Intuit, says that successes with powerful things, it tends to make companies stupid and they become less and less innovative. I believe that to be true, and I think that's a universal truth, which, by the way, is also the reason why I think Apple's heydays are over, because they're just too successful. So here's your three things. Disruption is never one feature. Your existing skills and processes are no longer relevant, and disruption always happens at the tipping point, at the go-to-market. Now, here's the good news about all of this. It is not that complicated. It truly is. There is no magic formula. It is hard, make no mistake, and it is complex, but it is not complicated. Most of this stuff is real common sense. If you've gone to business school, you heard about the 4 Ps, and the 4 Ps is not Pascal. The 4 Ps, of course, is product, price, promotion, and place. And remarkably, this is like 40-year-old knowledge about like how actually you bring a product to market. And remarkably, disruption happens at these 4 points. It's also chaotic. That's an important point to understand. And the previous speaker already spoke very eloquently about this. The idea is that you cannot spreadsheet your way through disruption. Disruption is this weird mixture between chaos and order. You need to build capacity inside of your organization and your people to be okay with ambiguity. And only the paranoid survive. That's Intel's mantra to this day, and I think it's a very, very true one. So let me show you something else. This is emerging research, and you're probably one of the first people. We are truly one of the first people to see this. So we all know this company. So we got really interested in this world of abundance, in this world of exponential technology and this world of disruption. And we started studying companies which create new business models, and we found something interesting, I believe. So you know this company, this is Instagram. Instagram is an interesting company. These are the 2 founders of Instagram, Kevin Systrom, Mike Creek. What Instagram did is, in less than 2 years, with this one blurry picture, they got to $1 billion exit with only 3 engineers. So something really interesting is happening when you can build a company, a tech company nonetheless, with only 3 engineers. And it comes down to something we call the stack. The stack works like this. The reason why someone like Kevin and Mike could build their company is because when you look at the platform they were using, the mobile phone, most of the software they needed to write was written for them because it was done as the stack. So they don't write the operating system. They don't write the camera operating system. They don't write any of that stuff. All they need to do is they need to write a tiny little bit of software on the very top of that stack, which allows you to apply a photo filter and allows you to share the pictures. That is how you build companies today. And we see this everywhere. You take something like Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg said that Facebook is built on open source from top to bottom. We have internal research which suggests that Facebook only writes about 5% of all the code which powers Facebook is their own code. Everything else is open source. Everything else is the stack. And it is not just Facebook. It is every company builds their stuff today on the stack. But here's the important thing. The stack is bigger than just software. This is, for example, Amazon, which allows you to use their whole fulfillment service as a service, meaning that you can have Amazon-style fulfillment. And this is important to understand. This is not just for people who sell on Amazon. Amazon rents this out to you regardless where you sell, because Amazon found out that they're really good at building these services and offering them as a stack solution. Here's a good example, Airbnb. So Airbnb not only uses tons and tons and tons of software, which they have not written, but enables them to run their company, but they also outsourced the actual physical ownership of the property. Airbnb now rents out about 500,000 nights a day as the largest hotel chain in the world without owning any property. The same is, of course, true for Uber and any of the other sharing economy companies. So they have moved the stack further and further up. And this is a trend we're seeing, companies moving further and further up in the stack and becoming deeply, deeply disruptive. The good news is that the stack itself becomes commoditized. There's a site, for example, called GitHub. On GitHub, you'll find software This software you can use freely to build whatever you want to build. There's now 96 million pieces of this software which you can use freely. There's literally software for everything, and it grows 40% year over year. When you go to Google and use Google for as a service, so for example, IT as a service, or you look at HR as a service, or you look at logistics as a service, you will find 142 million pages talking about as a service. You get everything as a service. You want to run a marketing department? You need one person and this set of tools, you plug them together and you have your full marketing department. You want to build a transportation company? These are all the companies you can have to create a transportation company. A friend of mine built a B2B air freight company out of Seattle. Their total staff is 12 people. 10 of those are data scientists. Everything else is the stack. They don't own a single plane. They don't own a single piece of hardware. They don't own anything. Everything is a stack. They just focus on the one thing where they think they can drive value, which is in the data science. Or, and of course you've seen this, I'm sure, you want to build something on the cloud. The cloud is literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of providers in the stack. So the stack allows you to bring down cost and time, which is the reason why large companies get disrupted by 2 people in a garage. Now, this has 2 important consequences. Number one is you can build companies, and most of the companies are built as companies at the top of the stack. So these are companies which basically leverage the existing infrastructure. And again, like, this is bigger than just software. The challenge with that is a lot of people are doing this. And there's something called the heat death theory. The heat death theory says that the first company which captures significant market share in any area will typically win the race. So this is slightly different than first mover advantage, which I don't believe in, but I believe in first winner advantage. And we see this over and over again. If you're Instagram, after Instagram won that race, was quick to the market, there was no room for anyone else. Here's the second one. You can actually build picks and shovels. You can build pieces of the infrastructure of the stack. Now, there's 2 things to consider about this. The first is the stack tends to be a monopoly or duopoly. So it's typically 2 dominant players and then a very long tail of non-dominant players. So if you're not a dominant player, you basically have lost the game. So think about think about operating systems. Operating systems today is basically just Windows and Mac OS. Think about mobile phone operating systems, Android and iOS. Think about server operating systems, which is Linux and Windows Server. Think about database products, MySQL and SQL Server, and then there's a massive long tail of nothingness. Even in the shipping industry, there's only 3 big players, DHL, FedEx, and UPS. They share the vast amount of the world. Now, the good news is if you own the stack, if you're one of those companies, you have untold riches in front of you. This is Red Hat, which builds server operating systems on a Linux stack. They have just been acquired by IBM for $34 billion US. So it is a very richly rewarding game, but it is a very tough game to play because there's typically only 2, maximum 3 companies which will win this game. So the question becomes, for me, is what do you do with this as a legacy business? I think there's 2 parts in there. The one is what every consultant will tell you, which is look at your value chain and figure out which of those pieces of the value chain can you replace better and cheaper by using something from the stack. The problem with most legacy businesses is that they have built pieces of the stack in their history, and often they run them less efficiently, less effectively than existing companies. Or, and this is the invitation, do what Amazon did with Amazon Web Services. If you don't know Amazon Web Services is basically Amazon renting out their cloud infrastructure, their computers. And here's how this worked. Jeff Bezos writes a memo, and you don't need to read this, is a lot of text, but the memo goes like this. He starts out with saying all teams will henceforth expose their data and functionality through service interfaces, because what he saw is that Amazon has become really good at running servers. And when you're really good at something, why not make it available to someone else if it's non-competitive to you? So he writes this memo, and the most important part of the memo is the last 2 pieces. Number 6 says, anyone who doesn't do this will be fired. Number 7 says, thank you, goodbye, have a great day. Amazon Web Services today is A, the largest cloud provider in the world. Secondly, it's the biggest revenue producer for Amazon. Here's the interesting thing. I actually think that most legacy businesses can do this. What we're doing today is, and we're doing this as an exercise, I do this over and over again with legacy businesses, medium-sized and large corporations, is we map out their value chain. We look at what are you doing? And then we look at this value chain and say, which of those value chain pieces can you either replace, but more importantly, which of those value chain pieces can you actually create new businesses around? Let me give you a very interesting example. You might know these guys, AB InBev. AB InBev is by far the largest beer brewer in the world. This is now a Brazilian, mostly Brazilian-owned company. And I was with the CEO and their leadership team in New York a little while ago. And the day before, I was at a company which dabbles or is a startup in the world of synthetic biology. So what they're doing is they basically genetically modify a bacteria to create new drugs, new medicine. And when you know anything about synthetic biology, one of the interesting things about synthetic biology is that very often they use yeast, which they genetically modify to turn the yeast effectively into a little factory, creating whatever you wanted to create. So I'm with AB InBev and I'm asking them an interesting question. I say, hey guys, you are the largest, you use yeast, correct? Because you use it for beer. And they say, yes, we are the largest yeast producer in the world. And if you know anything about yeast, yeast is an interesting organism because you need to keep it at specific temperatures and pressure for it to thrive, which is hard to do at scale. So I sit down with the leadership team and say, have you ever thought about taking your yeast production capacity and renting it out to other people? And they look at me and they're like, no, we didn't even know that this is a thing. So I bring them together with a synthetic biology company. And now AB InBev started a pilot where they use some of their yeast production capacity to rent it out to pharma companies, which has already turned into a $10 million business, literally all overnight. So I believe the invitation for you is to look at your value chain, reverse engineer your value chain, and figure out where in this value chain do you have interesting intersection points where you can turn your value chain into platform business models. This might be some of the biggest business opportunities you have ahead of you. Let me close on this. We're living in truly interesting times. For the first time in human history, individuals, people, communities have the same innovation power as large companies and even nations. Every time I tell this to an entrepreneur, they get really excited. Every time I show this to a large company, they get slightly freaked out. I believe it's an interesting invitation for us to create the future we want to live in. Here's a question I want to ask you. How much time did you spend deliberately thinking about the future in the last week? How much time did you sit down and actually take time out of your daily business to think about deliberately about the future? I do this exercise with Fortune 500s all over the world, and I can guarantee you that the answer is always almost zero. I think it's really important for us to find time on our calendars. And I understand there's a lot of demand you have and there's a lot of meetings you have, but take the least important meeting you have, cancel that meeting, and put an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, or 4 hours of time on your calendar every week to deliberately educate yourself about the future, to have conversation, and to figure out what the future will look like. Because I believe it is incredibly, incredibly powerful and important to us. As my friend Ron Shaik, who is the CEO, president, and founder of Panera Bread, which is one of the largest fast food chain, healthy fast food chains here in the US, said, our approach has always been to discover today what will matter tomorrow, and then to transform our company into a future that is unfolding before us. I believe that is what we have to do as leaders. Our role as leaders is to figure out what matters tomorrow and then help our companies to transform themselves into that future. With that being said, thank you so much for being a patient audience. I wish I could have been there with you in person. It's much more entertaining, I bet. If you want to be in touch, the easiest way to reach out to me is if you send an email to this email address. I will send you back an automatic email which has all my contact details, my LinkedIn, my V-card, and everything else you possibly can need. So with that being said, thank you so much. And let me see if I can stop my screen share. And I believe we have a little bit of time for question and answers.
Thank you very much. And here is Pascal. Everybody was closely and very interested in listening to your slides and into your story and everything you shared with us. Thank you very much. Now we have time for some questions. So, was sind die Fragen? Gibt es eine Frage, die unter den Nägeln brennt? By the way, do you understand German?
Ich spreche noch Deutsch. Mein Deutsch ist ziemlich holprig, deswegen präsentiere ich in der Regel nur in Englisch. So sorry. Zu lange aus Deutschland weg. Ich bin mal in Köln groß geworden.
Okay, gut. Da kommt die erste Frage. The first question. I will repeat. Fragen Sie einfach laut.
Und wir können auch in Deutsch, ich glaube, wir können auch in Deutsch. Ich kann, wenn euch das, mein holpriges Deutsch nichts ausspricht, spreche ich auch gerne Deutsch.
Solange es nicht Kölsch ist, verstehen wir alles.
Ja, sehr gut.
Sie haben bestimmt gehört, dass Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking und Bill Gates Geld in eine Foundation gesteckt haben, um die Entwicklung von AI, sagen wir mal, menschenfreundlich zu gestalten. Nach dem, was Sie gerade eben alles gesagt haben, wird relativ bald der Zeitpunkt kommen, wo die Maschinen viel mehr können als wir. Wie sehen Sie, was die Menschen auf dieser Welt in Zukunft noch machen werden, zu tun haben, damit zurechtkommen?
Ja, ich glaube, ich bin da etwas differenzierter und etwas optimistischer vielleicht. Kurz zum Thema Differenzierung. Also ich glaube, es gibt eine sehr wichtige Unterscheidung zwischen Computational Power und Maschinenbewusstsein. Computational Power ist das, worüber ich spreche. Das heißt, Maschinen werden sehr rechenleistungsstark werden, sehr schnell. Sind sie heute schon und werden sie noch mehr in der Zukunft sein. Das bedeutet aber nicht, dass die Maschinen intelligent sind per se. Das heißt, also Leute wie zum Beispiel Andrew Ng, einer der führenden, wenn nicht gar der führende Wissenschaftler im Bereich künstliche Intelligenz, unterrichtet bei Stanford unter anderem, deren Meinung ist, und ich gehe da auch mehr mit deren Meinung ist, dass wir noch mindestens 50 Jahre davon entfernt sind, dass wir wirklich intelligente Maschinen haben, was auch immer Intelligenz sein mag. Ich glaube, die Einladung für uns ist darüber nachzudenken, wie können Maschinen, ich glaube, wir bewegen uns viel schneller in eine Welt, wo Maschinen und Mensch koexistieren. Und das tun sie heute schon, wenn wir zum Beispiel über Google Maps nachdenken. Also heute denke ich über Navigation nicht mehr nach, sondern ich hole mein Telefon raus und trage die Adresse ein und die Maschine hilft mir heute schon. Andrew hat eine interessante Art und Weise, das auszudrücken. Er sagt, dass jede Entscheidung, die wir heute treffen, die weniger als eine Sekunde braucht, werden in der Zukunft künstliche Intelligenzen treffen, und zwar besser als wir. Ich glaube, das macht Sinn. Das ist eine sehr einleuchtende Ansage. Was das bedeutet für uns als Mensch ist, dass Maschinen viele der Dinge, die heute irgendwie Routinearbeit sind, übernehmen werden und uns damit befreien, uns um die Dinge zu kümmern, die wirklich interessant sind, nämlich die kreative Arbeit, das menschliche Zusammensein etc. Also ich bin da etwas differenzierter als Elon und Konsorten. Und auch so dieses Thema Zukunft der Arbeit, was ja auch damit reinhängt, und Robotics etc. Ich glaube, es gibt einen Unterschied zwischen, ich glaube, das ist gut zu verstehen, zwischen, im Englischen sagen wir Jobs and Professions, also Arbeit und Arbeitsbilder oder Jobs und Arbeitsbilder. Arbeitsbilder werden weggehen, also wenn ich irgendwie heute Junior-Rechtsanwalt bin und mein Job ist, irgendwie durch Dokumente durchzugehen und nach irgendwelche Dinge zu highlighten. Der Job wird weggehen, ohne Frage, was aber nicht bedeutet, dass die Arbeit selbst weggeht, also der Job selbst weggeht. Also ich bin da etwas differenzierter.
Dankeschön für diese Antwort. Dann gucke ich nochmal ins weite Rund. Noch eine Frage. Da ist keine Frage, da telefoniert jemand, okay. Okay, dann sagen wir, nee, hier ist noch eine Frage. Eine Frage haben wir noch.
Gerne.
Hallo, mich würde interessieren, welche Gefahren du siehst auch bezüglich sozialen Zusammenhalt. Also ich beobachte, dass irgendwie große Unternehmen wie Amazon, die verkaufen alle Pampers, alle Batterien, alle Produkte. Was für Konsequenzen hat es auch vielleicht für die Welt global, wenn sich der Reichtum auch auf wenige verteilen könnte?
Ja, sehr gute Frage und auch eine der Fragen, die wir sehr viel diskutieren bei Singularity und die ich auch persönlich sehr viel diskutiere. Ich berate unter anderem auch einige das Ganze braucht ein bisschen länger. Also wenn wir jetzt nochmal um 2 Stunden hätten, würde ich gerne das ausbreiten.
Der Tag fängt doch erst an bei dir.
Ja, die kurze Antwort darauf ist, ich bin weniger besorgt über den Endzustand. Ich glaube, den Endzustand, die Zukunft, der Endzustand der Zukunft kann durchaus sehr positiv sein oder wird sehr, sehr positiv sein, weil wir Technologie einsetzen können, um tatsächlich einige der größten Probleme in der Welt zu lösen. Die 2 Dinge, die mich besorgen, ist, das eine ist, Technologie macht nur das, zumindest für die absehbare Zukunft, macht nur das, was der Mensch sie machen lässt oder der Mensch schafft diese Entscheidungen. Und Menschen haben zumindest gerade im Moment nicht besonders einen guten Track Record, die richtigen Dinge zu machen. Also wenn ich da zum Beispiel über meinen Präsidenten nachdenke, hier in den USA oder auch Brexit und so weiter, gibt es ja durchaus Bedenkenträger dort. Ich glaube, das ist das eine. Das andere ist, was mich sehr beunruhigt, ist der Weg, wie wir von heute in diese Zukunft kommen. Und ich glaube, das wird sehr, sehr holprig sein. Und ich glaube, da gibt es eine sehr wichtige Diskussion und Aktion, die wir haben müssen, um Menschen mitzunehmen auf dieser Reise. Und ich glaube, das passiert im Moment nicht. Und das beunruhigt mich. Ich weiß nicht, ob wir Politiker in der Runde im Moment haben. Ich arbeite auch mit einigen deutschen Politikern zusammen. Und ganz generell und sehr verallgemeinert muss ich sagen, dass Politiker im Moment noch zu sehr in ihren 4-Jahreszyklen denken, was mich auch beunruhigt. Also da gibt es viel zu viel darüber nachdenken, irgendwie, wie wird man denn wiedergewählt und was ist denn jetzt im Moment populär, statt halt längerfristige Sichtweisen zu wählen und zu sagen, was passiert denn in 20 Jahren und was müssen wir heute machen, damit wir in 20 Jahren an diesem Punkt sind. Generell, also ich glaube, ich bin grundsätzlich optimistisch. Ich glaube, das ist meine Natur, meine natürliche Einstellung. Glaube aber, dass wir viel Arbeit machen müssen, um dorthin zu kommen.
Ist die Frage beantwortet? Ja. Es braucht 2 Stunden. Okay, gut. Eine Frage haben wir noch. Haben wir noch eine zweite? Genau. Eine letzte? Ja.
Gerne.
Klasse. Vielen Dank erstmal. Ich fand den sehr, sehr inspirierend, den Vortrag, und auch spannend vorgetragen. Also danke auf jeden Fall nochmal. Eine Frage grundsätzlich zu WeChat und China. Also wir sehen es ja da auch, Zentralisierung in einem Tool von allen Services. Ja. Wenn du dazu nochmal irgendwie 3, 4 Sätze sagen könntest, wäre mir sehr spannend, deine Meinung dazu zu hören.
Ja, total, gerne. Ganz kurz, das hat überhaupt nichts mit der Frage zu tun. Ihr bekommt die Slides von meinem Vortrag, also ich habe die an das Team weitergeleitet und die werden die euch verteilen, dass ihr die Slides auch habt. China. China ist extrem spannend. Ich glaube, dass China in den nächsten, was auch immer der Zeitraum sein wird, 10 Jahren, 15 Jahren, was auch immer, die dominante Weltmacht wird. Aus dem einfachen Grunde, dass die halt extrem aggressiv vorgehen und sehr gezielt vorgehen. Ich war kürzlich in Berlin und habe in Berlin auf so einem Symposium gesessen, unter anderem mit einigen Wirtschaftsleuten und Politikern, und habe einen Punkt gemacht, einfach um diese Dominanz von China zu zeigen. Wenn man sich anguckt, das Geld, das im Moment ausgegeben wird für Grundlagenforschung im Bereich künstliche Intelligenz, ist in den USA in diesem Jahr 2018 ist ungefähr 25 Milliarden US-Dollar. China gibt um die 30 bis 35 Milliarden US-Dollar aus und Europa gesamt gibt 3,5 Milliarden US-Dollar aus. Das gibt mir sehr deutlich, unglücklicherweise, aber gibt mir sehr deutlich einen Indikator, wer im Grunde dieses Wettrennen beherrschen wird. Es wird also einfach zwischen USA und China sein. Und wenn man dann über künstliche Intelligenz nachdenkt, künstliche Intelligenz braucht Daten. Das ist das Futter für künstliche Intelligenz. Wer sammelt mehr Daten als jeder andere Staat in der Welt? China, weil die sich halt um das ganze Thema Datenschutz einfach mal gar nicht kümmern. Die USA halt etwas weniger und dann Europa natürlich sehr stark. Deswegen glaube ich, dass wir so ein nukleares Wettrennen sehen, das China gewinnen wird. WeChat ist, wenn man WeChat sich mal angeguckt hat, ist es, also aus meiner Sicht ist es Wahnsinn zu sehen, wie schnell und wie aggressiv WeChat im Grunde zur dominanten Plattform in China geworden ist, was auch sehr große Gefahren birgt. Natürlich, ja, also China als im Grunde ja totalitäres System. Der Traum eines jeden totalitären Systems ist es, alles über jeden Bürger zu wissen. Und das sehen wir auch in China. In China gibt es ja diesen Social Score jetzt, wo wir soziale Interaktionen zwischen Menschen messen und messbar machen und dann dir Services zum Beispiel verweigern, wenn du halt einen Score hast, der zu niedrig ist. Das ist halt für mich das echte Dystopia. Ja? Das ist totaler Horror, aber unglücklicherweise das, was passiert. Also China keep an eye on it. Meine Hoffnung ist, dass wir als Menschen uns dazu entscheiden, nicht totalitäre Systeme über totalitäre Systeme zu benutzen, also Demokratie über die chinesische Form von Kommunismus. Aber im Moment sieht es halt nicht besonders gut aus. Aber spannend, ganz spannend zu sehen. Also China ist, ich empfehle jedem, der irgendwie in Silicon Valley kommt, auch mal nach Shanghai oder Beijing oder Guangdong oder Shenzhen zu fliegen, einfach um mal zu sehen, wie dort gearbeitet wird, weil es ist schon anders.
Vielen Dank für die Frage zu Chinification. Wen haben wir noch? Haben wir noch eine Frage? Keine Fragen mehr? Dann können wir den Vorhang schließen quasi. Vielen Dank, Pascal, für einen großartigen Vortrag. Nochmal ein Applaus aus Stuttgart. Bye, bye.
Danke.